The first time he brought her home was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the light filters through the trees like golden lace, and the breeze carries the scent of cinnamon and old leaves. I remember because I had baked a pecan pie, the kind he always loved growing up. I'd set the table with the good dishes, ivory porcelain, with the faded gold trim, the ones I only pulled out when I wanted someone to feel honored. And there she was, standing just behind him on the porch, soft-spoken shoulders slightly hunched, as if she didn't want to take up too much space. Her hair was tied back in a braid, her eyes gentle but cautious, and her smile, well, it didn't quite reach all the way, like she wasn't sure if she was truly welcome. She handed me a small potted orchid, delicate and trembling in the wind, and I remember thinking, that's a thoughtful gift. But before I could thank her properly, my daughter called from the kitchen something about the roast drying out, and the moment passed. Still I noticed. At dinner she sat beside him and barely spoke, unless someone asked her a direct question, and even then, her answers were short, careful. When she did speak up to share a little story about her parents, I saw my daughter glance at my eldest and raise an eyebrow, lips twitching, with a smug little smile. No one said anything outright, but the silence was loud, the kind of silence that wraps itself around a person like barbed wire, tight, invisible, and meant to hurt without leaving a mark. I tried to draw her out, asked about her work, her studies, her hobbies. She lit up for a moment when she talked about volunteering at a library, something about helping elderly readers with large print catalogs. That warmed me. She had a gentleness about her that was rare these days. But my granddaughter cut her off, changed the subject to some influencer's wedding dress, and the rest of the table followed. Later, after they'd left, and the house was quiet again, I walked by the windows and noticed the orchid still on the sideboard where she'd left it. It hadn't made it to the dining table. I stared at it for a long time, the way the petals drooped just a little, like they too were wondering if they belonged. I told myself it was nerves, that first meetings are hard, and that she'd find her place eventually. But in hindsight, I think she already knew, and maybe deep down so did I. The next few visits followed a pattern I began to recognize, a hush in the room. Whenever she entered, like the air itself held its breath. No one ever said anything cruel, not exactly. But kindness wasn't present either. And sometimes I've learned that kind of coldness leaves deeper bruises than words ever could. She always tried, though. That was the part that stung the most, watching her bring homemade cookies in little paper boxes, compliment someone's hair or earrings, offer to help with dishes. And they'd smile, nod politely, but there was always this barrier, something invisible but immovable. They laughed harder at each other's jokes when she was quiet. They made plans out loud for trips or brunches she wasn't included in, even as she sat right there. My grandson would occasionally try to bring her in, asking her opinion, but the moment she spoke, it was as if the room took a collective pause and then swerved away. I once saw my daughter-in-law lean over to my daughter after the girl had excused herself to the restroom. She whispered something behind her hand, and they both laughed, that smug kind of laugh, low and cruel, the kind that doesn't come from joy, but from exclusion. I wanted to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. That too is something age teaches you, how often silence is not peace, but a prison. At night, I'd sit in my chair by the window and try to make sense of it. Was it her clothes? She dressed plainly but neatly. Was it her background? So what if her family didn't come from money? Neither did I once. Maybe it was her quietness, her soft way of moving through the world. My family had grown sharp-edged over the years, hardened by success, always performing, always climbing. And she didn't climb. She planted roots. I invited her once to join me in the garden. I thought maybe just the two of us, away from their eyes. she'd feel safe enough to open up. And she did just a little. She knelt in the dirt beside me, her fingers brushing against the mint leaves, and told me about her childhood. Her grandmother used to grow herbs, too. They'd dry rosemary together in bundles and hang them by the window. It was a small thing, that memory, but her face softened as she told it, and I saw something I hadn't seen before, not fear, not distance, but grief, a quiet kind of loneliness that had built itself a home inside her chest. And even then, I didn't quite understand how deeply she was being hurt by the people I loved, how slowly they were bleeding her out with smiles and cold glances. But I felt it. I felt it in the way she sighed when she stood up, in the way she said thank you, like it was water in a desert. The tension wasn't just unspoken, it was designed. I've never been one to give up on people quickly. Maybe it's the way I was raised. You keep a chair at the table even if no one sits in it. You offer bread even when your pantry's near empty. That's what love is to me. Not a performance, not an aesthetic, a quiet persistence, a choice to make room for someone even when the house feels full. So I kept trying. I invited her for tea one afternoon when the others weren't around. I didn't want it to feel like a test or a trap, just two women in the sunroom with chipped porcelain cups and the scent of lemon balm steeping between us. She was hesitant at first, said she didn't want to impose, but when I insisted, really insisted, she finally smiled and sat down. I asked her about her job. She worked in community support, helping low-income families apply for housing and financial aid. I saw her eyes glow when she talked about the kids. She helped how proud she was when a single mother got keys to her own place. And in that moment, she seemed to forget the tightness in her shoulders, the stiffness in her smile. I liked her, truly. She wasn't showy, but she had substance. She listened. She paid attention. When I told her about my arthritis acting up, she asked thoughtful questions, not just how are you, but what helps on rainy days. That kind of kindness, the kind that listens all the way through, is rare. A few weeks later, I gave her a necklace. It wasn't flashy, just a locket that had belonged to my mother. It had a tiny pressed flower inside, brittle with age, but still intact. I told her it had always reminded me that even fragile things can last if cared for gently. She looked stunned when I placed it in her hands. "Are you sure?" she asked, as though no one had ever trusted her with something precious before. I smiled and said yes, and I meant it. She wore it the next time she came for dinner. I saw her fingers brush against it nervously as she walked into the room. For a brief second, I felt hope. Maybe this was the bridge. But they noticed. Oh, they noticed. My daughter's eyes locked onto the necklace. My daughter-in-law's smirk returned. And by dessert, someone had made a joke about vintage things looking dusty. She didn't wear it again. I never asked why. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence speaks with the weight of a scream. I kept that afternoon in my heart like a secret song, the way she laughed when the teacup handle came loose, how she offered to sweep the porch before leaving, how she hugged me goodbye like I was someone worth holding on to. But with every visit that followed, I could see her folding into herself, like a letter no one wanted to read. And still I kept trying, because if no one else in that house had the decency to show her warmth, then I would do it twice over every chance I got. It was a Sunday lunch, one of those long, drawn-out gatherings where the food cools before the tension does. I'd made roast chicken mashed potatoes with too much butter and green beans that no one but me seemed to enjoy anymore. The dining room was loud with clinking silverware and overlapping conversations, but underneath it all was that same undercurrent I'd begun to recognize. She was there, of course, sitting beside my grandson, her hands neatly folded in her lap. She only spoke when spoken to. I noticed how carefully she chewed, how often she looked down at her plate rather than meet the eyes of the family, like she was trying to make herself invisible, or maybe smaller. They talked over her, around her, and occasionally about her, but never to her. And then it happened. I had stepped into the kitchen to refill the lemonade, moving slower these days, but still sharp in my hearing. The walls between the dining room and kitchen have always been thin. They didn't know I could hear them. My own daughter, chuckled lightly and said, "She just doesn't fit our vibe, you know." The clatter of forks paused. Then came murmured agreements, a few snorts, one drawn-out "yeah," as if they'd all just been waiting for someone to say it aloud. I stood there holding a sweating pitcher, the chill from the glass crawling up my wrist. I waited, hoping someone might defend her, that maybe my grandson would speak up. But he said nothing, and the silence was approval. "She's too plain," my granddaughter added. "No sparkle, no presence. I mean, what does she do?" "She works with poor people, doesn't she?" someone said. I couldn't tell who. It all blurred after that. I stared at the pitcher, the way the lemon slices floated on the surface. I thought of the first time I'd poured lemonade for my grandson when he was little, how he used to smile and call it sunshine water. And now here I was, eavesdropping on cruelty, dressed in linen and lace, surrounded by fine dishes and finer egos. When I walked back in, I kept my face smooth. I handed out the glasses, smiled where expected, laughed at a tired joke about politics. But inside, something shifted. Not a break, not yet, more like a slow cracking in the walls of a house you've lived in too long. I caught her eye once across the table. She must have known something was wrong, because her eyes softened, searching mine, like a child looking for a parent in a crowd. I didn't say a word, but I held her gaze longer than was polite. Maybe she saw it, the apology in my expression, the promise. They kept talking like nothing had happened. I kept pouring lemonade, and she kept sitting there like a guest in a family that had already decided she didn't belong. But I knew. And once you know, there's no going back to pretending you don't. It was my 75th birthday. A quiet milestone or so, I thought. I didn't want much, just the presence of my family, a good meal, a cake with too much frosting, and maybe a few kind words. I didn't need gifts. I only wanted proof that what I'd spent a lifetime building this family still held something sacred. They planned a party at the house, brought in catering, set up pastel-colored decorations, even hired a photographer. It should have made me feel special, but something about it felt rehearsed, like I was being celebrated out of obligation, not love. She came, of course. Wore a soft blue dress, simple but elegant. Her hair was pinned back, and I noticed she'd added a small silver clip, maybe, to look more put together for the others. I smiled when I saw her. She looked nervous, holding a gift bag, like it might explode if she carried it too tightly. The photographer was gathering everyone on the patio for family photos. They called people over by name, arranged siblings, spouses, cousins. And when my grandson stood with his arm around me, I looked around and asked, "Where is she?" My daughter answered too quickly. "Oh, we asked her to take the pictures." I turned to look, and there she was, standing alone near the azaleas, holding the camera like it was a shield. She was smiling that brittle kind of smile that hides humiliation, and waved at us like she wasn't the only one not invited into the frame. I didn't say anything right away. I should have. I wish I had. But instead I stood there while the shutter clicked, and a false memory was captured, one that left her out entirely. Later I found her in the kitchen helping clear plates. I touched her arm and said softly, "You should have been in the photo." She looked up, surprised, then forced a laugh. "It's okay," she said. "I didn't want to ruin the vibe." The word hit me like a bell in my chest. The vibe. The very thing they'd accused her of not fitting. And now she was using it on herself. That's what happens, doesn't it? You hear something often enough and you start believing it's true. That night, after the last dish was put away and the house went quiet, I sat alone in the dining room, staring at the leftover cake. No one had taken a slice home. The candles were still half melted. The flowers were already wilting. And all I could think about was how birthdays are meant to honor the passage of time, to say, you matter. You're still here. But all I felt was a ghost of celebration. And all she got was a job behind the lens. That was the night I stopped defending their silence. Because silence can bruise just as deeply as a slap. And it was time I started paying attention to where the bruises were landing. It was a bitter winter that year, the kind that makes the trees groan at night and turns your breath into ribbons the moment you step outside. I'd taken to knitting again, something I hadn't done regularly since my hands began aching in the cold. But I wanted to do something with my time that wasn't waiting. Waiting for a phone call, waiting for the next holiday, waiting for some sign that the family I raised still carried a heartbeat. I chose a soft gray wool, not fancy, not dyed in jewel tones like my daughter preferred, but warm, gentle. I made the shawl wide and long, something to wrap around the shoulders like a whisper. And when I finished it, I folded it neatly and tied it with a bit of twine. No card, no ceremony. I just brought it with me when I knew she'd be there next. They were having another gathering, an impromptu dinner, just an excuse for wine and small talk. She was sitting alone in the corner of the living room, scrolling quietly on her phone, while the others laughed over some inside joke. I walked over and offered it to her without a word. She looked up slowly. Her hands hesitated, hovering over the package like it might vanish if she moved too fast. When she untied the twine and unfolded the shawl, her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, her eyes filled. Not dramatically, no gasps, no sobs, just a shimmer, a soft cracking. She looked at me like I'd given her something much bigger than wool and time. I've never had anyone make something for me before, she said, her voice barely audible. I smiled and said, well, now you have. She put it around her shoulders right then and there, wore it like armor, sat a little straighter after that. But when my daughter saw her face shifted, just slightly, I watched as she leaned into her husband's ear and muttered something. His eyes glanced our way, and then the two of them laughed under their breath. No one said anything aloud again, but the silence after that was heavy. It pressed into the room like fog. They didn't include her in conversation that night, didn't ask her about work, didn't pass her the bowl of salad, unless she asked twice. They punished her for being loved. It hit me in that moment how fragile kindness had become in our family. How a simple gesture, something handmade, something meant, could be treated like a declaration of war. After dessert, she found me in the hallway. She waited until no one was near, then reached for my hand and squeezed it. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me. I didn't reply. I couldn't. My throat tightened too fast. I just gave her hand a light squeeze back. That night I sat in bed and looked at the shawl pattern still folded beside my lamp. I ran my fingers across the stitches, row after row, and thought about how each one was an act of care, quiet and slow like healing. They had their pearls and their heels and their private jokes, but I had knit something that warmed someone's bones. And maybe, just maybe, that meant more. I wasn't looking for it, truly. I wasn't snooping or prying or digging for drama. I was only trying to check the weather of all things. The tablet was on the kitchen counter, left open after my granddaughter had finished scrolling through furniture catalogs or whatever shiny distractions she spent her days chasing. I tapped the screen, and a group chat popped up before I could close it. At first, I didn't even realize what I was looking at, just a flurry of names and bubble after bubble of texts. But then I saw her name not as a participant, no, but as a subject. And once I saw it, I couldn't look away. They had a nickname for her, a cruel little thing. I won't repeat it because even now it leaves a sour taste in my mouth. But it was mocking her clothes, her job, even the way she pronounced certain words. She wore those knockoff boots again, LOL. Someone get her a stylist or a mirror. Imagine raising your standards and then still bringing her. She smells like lavender and shame. That locket is probably from Etsy. The messages scrolled on, each worse than the last. And they were laughing, not just teasing laughing, grown people, my blood ganging up in this silent private corridor where cruelty had no consequence. My daughter was there, my son, even my granddaughter typing emojis and gifs to punctuate the mockery like it was a party. I stood there frozen. The kettle behind me began to hiss. I didn't move. She didn't know. That was the worst part. She had no idea this entire side conversation existed. No clue that every time she tried to be kind, to belong, they were documenting it like it was a performance to be graded and mocked. I thought of the necklace, the one I'd given her, the one they laughed at behind her back, called Dusty. That locket had held a pressed flower from my own mother's garden, something fragile, yes, but sacred. They didn't see meaning in things unless it came with a receipt or a brand. I closed the tablet. Later that night, I lay awake for hours. I thought about how many times I'd defended my children, told myself they were just tired, stressed, caught up in their own lives. I thought of all the little silences I'd swallowed, the excuses I'd made. And I wondered how much ugliness had I allowed just by not naming it. When did this family turn so cold, so performative? They had homes and handbags and holidays in Santorini, but their hearts were hollowed out, carved clean for status and sarcasm. And this girl, this woman they mocked, had done nothing but try. She had asked for nothing but space to exist. I felt sick. I wanted to erase every photo on that tablet, every cruel word. But you can't unwrite poison once it's been swallowed. All you can do is decide who you'll be next. And in that moment, I made a choice. Not out of revenge, not out of rage, but out of clarity. Some people protect with silence, but I was done being quiet. The next morning, I called my daughter. I told her I wanted to talk, just us. No brunch setting, no audience, no distractions. She offered to meet at the new cafe near her house, the one with overpriced coffee and chairs designed more for Instagram than comfort. I agreed, even though the place made me feel like a misplaced relic. When I arrived, she was already there, sipping something with foam shaped like a leaf. She smiled as I sat down, but there was a flicker of discomfort in her eyes. Maybe she sensed I wasn't here to chat about upholstery. I saw the group chat, I said. The smile fell. She stared at me for a moment, then scoffed. You weren't supposed to see that. No apology, no remorse. Just annoyance that I'd caught a glimpse of their ugly underbelly. She's not who you think she is, my daughter said, as if that explained everything. She's not us. I looked at her, my firstborn, the child I'd rocked through fevers and first days of school, and I asked softly, and who exactly are we supposed to be? She rolled her eyes. Mom, don't be dramatic. It's not like we hate her. She just doesn't fit what I asked. She leaned in, lowering her voice like the very walls might gossip. Our family has a certain standard. She's awkward. She dresses like she shops in bulk. She works with people who don't know the difference between a salad fork and a soup spoon. She doesn't elevate us. Elevate. That word. It dropped into my chest like a stone. And since when is love supposed to elevate anyone, I said. Isn't it meant to soften, to anchor, to accept? My daughter took a sip of her coffee and shrugged. She makes him look small. I stared at her for a long silent moment. Then I said something I hadn't planned. something that came from the very deepest, oldest part of me. No, dear, you make yourself small when you measure people in inches of status. She flinched just slightly, like I'd flicked a switch she didn't know was there. Then defensively she added, "We were just joking, Mom. It's just group chat banter. You're overreacting." I shook my head. Mocking someone behind their back isn't banter. It's cowardice dressed up in emojis. Her face hardened. She doesn't belong. Period. I stood up. Slowly, carefully. My bones don't move as fast as they used to, but I felt tall that day. Taller than I had in years. "She doesn't need to belong to your version of this family," I said, "because your version, it's broken." She blinked at me, stunned. For the first time in a long while, she didn't have a comeback. I left her there in her trendy cafe with her pretty little cup staring at the door I'd walked through. On the ride home, I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I wasn't even angry. I felt something clearer than rage. Conviction. They'd built a family around appearances, around curated perfection, around the idea of vibes. But what they'd lost along the way was decency. And I had just decided I was no longer willing to fund that kind of legacy. It was Easter when everything finally snapped. Not with a bang, not with some loud cinematic confrontation, but with a chair. A single empty chair that said more than anyone's voice ever could. They were hosting dinner at my daughter's house that year. Everything was curated within an inch of its life. Ivory tablecloths, gold-rimmed plates, candles that smelled like something French and expensive. There were name cards at every setting, as if we were attending a gala, instead of just passing mashed potatoes to each other. I arrived early, as I always did. I helped fold the linen napkins and cut the lemon slices for the water glasses. I asked where she was, the girl, the one they claimed not to hate, but still never named. "Oh, my daughter," said breezily. She politely declined, said she had other plans. I nodded slowly, but something didn't sit right. It was the way she said it, light rehearsed. Not hurt, not even surprised. Just pleased. It wasn't until we all sat down that I noticed. 11 chairs, 10 filled. One directly next to my grandson left empty. Not forgotten, deliberately empty. Her name wasn't on a card. Her glass hadn't been filled. I looked around the table waiting for someone to say something, maybe a joke about running late, a gesture of inclusion. But no one did. They ate. They passed the rolls. They talked about trips and spa packages and what kind of flowers were trending for weddings. And that empty chair, it just sat there. Quiet. Heavy. A monument to exclusion. My grandson didn't look up once. Didn't explain. Didn't seem to care. I couldn't take it anymore. After the first course, I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone. I found her number, which I'd asked for quietly weeks ago. I called. She answered after 3 rings. Her voice was soft, cautious. I asked her, "Why didn't you come today?" There was a pause. Then she said I wasn't invited. Just those 3 words. So gentle, so honest, so damning. She didn't sound bitter. She sounded tired. They told me it was family only, she added, and that I shouldn't make it awkward. I stood in that hallway and felt something crack deep in my chest. I told her thank you for the truth, for trying, for enduring. She didn't say much in return, only whispered, "I hope you have a nice Easter." She still had grace, even after all that. When I returned to the table, no one asked where I'd gone. No one noticed. And in that moment, I saw all of them. My children, their spouses, my grandchildren. Not as they were, but as they had become. Curated, controlled, dressed up in civility, but emptied of compassion. I didn't finish my dinner. I didn't make a scene. I simply placed my napkin on the plate and quietly, deliberately walked out. No one followed. The only sound behind me was laughter, but it no longer sounded like home. That chair had been empty, but it had never been unoccupied. It held the weight of everything they had chosen not to be. A few months before all that, before the chair, before the call, before the hallway, where my throat closed around unspoken grief, I had given them a gift. It was early winter when I decided. I'd met with my financial advisor, reviewed the inheritance, the trusts, the accounts I'd once guarded like heirlooms. I had saved all my life not for luxury, but for stability, for legacy. And as I watched them plan the wedding, I'd thought, maybe this will bring them closer. Maybe generosity will smooth the rough edges. So I gave them a portion of it, a generous one, enough to cover a beautiful ceremony, a decent down payment, and some cushion for the start of their new life. It wasn't wrapped in ribbons or delivered with fanfare. I simply handed the documents to my grandson with a quiet, "This is yours now. Use it well." He hugged me. She thanked me. At the time, I believed they meant it. But I learned piece by piece what they did with it. There was no wedding, at least not in the way one hopes. No invitation arrived at my door. No handwritten note. No save the date. I asked about the plans and was brushed off with vague words. "We're keeping it small. We want something private. We'll send photos." And eventually the photos did come posted online, filtered and staged, sunlit and soulless. They had flown to the coast, rented a villa perched above the ocean with lanterns hung from olive trees and champagne on every table. The wedding, if it could be called that, was more of a branding event. No family was present, not even me. But she was there. That surprised me. Smiling in the photos, yes, but I saw her eyes. They were distant, too calm. The kind of calm you develop when you've finally stopped hoping for inclusion and started practicing survival. They'd used the money for luxury, a week-long honeymoon in a glass cabin on a cliff, designer rings, drone footage, a hashtag. But not a place for me, not a place for her either, not really. I asked my daughter once casually, was the wedding everything they wanted? She smirked. Oh, definitely. No drama, no outsiders, just them and the vibe they actually wanted. That word again, vibe, it had become their god. They worshipped at the altar of aesthetic and burned love as the offering. It wasn't just that they spent the money, it was how they spent it. Like kindness had no value unless it could be photographed, cropped, and shared. Like intimacy was something to be curated rather than lived. I sat alone one night and opened the folder of paperwork, the receipts, the wire confirmations. I held them like old letters from a friendship that never truly existed. That money had come from my late husband's pension from decades of careful saving and skipping indulgences. It was meant to bless, to protect, to uplift. But in their hands it became costume jewelry. I couldn't get it back, but I could choose what I did with the rest. And slowly, like dawn rising behind storm clouds, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not out of vengeance, out of reverence. For her, for what love is supposed to feel like. For the parts of me that still remembered how to build something sacred. It was early spring when she showed up at my porch. No warning, no call, just the sound of soft knocking on the screen door. I was in the kitchen peeling carrots for stew, and for some reason I knew it was her before I even looked. She stood there, wrapped in the gray shawl I'd made her hair loose around her shoulders, eyes puffy but dry. A single suitcase sat behind her on the steps. I opened the door, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked like someone who had finally stopped trying to swim against the current and simply let herself drift to shore. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. She sat at the table like she'd done it 100 times, though we both knew it had only been a handful. She placed her hands flat against the wood and stared down at her fingers like they might fall apart. "I'm leaving," she said. I didn't know where else to go. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say goodbye to someone who made me feel human. That sentence, it broke something deep in me, something that had been cracking slowly for years. I made her tea, chamomile and honey. She cupped the mug in both hands like it was the only warm thing she had left. "They told me I was making things difficult," she said quietly, "that I was bringing the energy down, that I needed to smile more, wear different clothes, talk less about work. And when I really tried, it just got worse." She looked up at me then. "You're the only person who ever saw me. Not tolerated me, saw me." I wanted to say so many things, that she was kind, that she deserved joy, that being small in their world didn't mean she wasn't whole in mine, but all I managed was, "You didn't deserve any of it." She nodded, her hands trembled. "I loved him," she whispered, "but I couldn't keep loving someone who let me be erased." And I understood, far more than she realized. I offered to drive her to the bus station. She declined, said she'd already arranged a ride, just needed a moment to breathe somewhere that didn't hate her softness. So I sat with her. No big gestures, no speeches, just two women in a quiet house letting the silence settle not as judgment, but as comfort. Before she left, I gave her a bag of leftovers and slipped a folded envelope into her coat pocket. Inside was enough money to get her through a few months, maybe more. I didn't label it. I didn't say a word. As she stood on the porch again, suitcase in hand, she turned back and said, "You were the only good part of that family." I didn't correct her. She stepped into the waiting car and I watched until the taillights vanished. No one else called that day. No one asked where she'd gone. But I knew. She left with nothing but her dignity, and that's more than most of them ever carried. I didn't act out of rage. Rage burns too hot and fast. It leaves smoke and broken things behind. What I felt after she left was something colder, steadier, a clarity so sharp it made everything else blur around the edges. I pulled out the folder where I kept all my legal documents, the will, the asset spreadsheets, the power of attorney forms. They were tucked between photo albums and old letters, as if sentimentality and practicality lived in the same breath. I spread them across my kitchen table, the same one where she had sat just days before, hands shaking over a chipped mug of chamomile. And then I made a call. My lawyer is a kind man, younger than my children, but with a gentleness in his voice that always made me feel like I was being listened to. I told him I needed to make changes, significant ones. He offered to come to the house. I said yes. When he arrived, I had already made tea and set out a plate of shortbread cookies. It felt strange to talk about legacy and betrayal over sugar and porcelain, but I've learned that life rarely separates the bitter from the sweet. We went through everything. I removed names. I erased their titles and claims. I shifted funds, redirected trusts. I made sure my house, the one I had scrubbed with my own 2 hands for 40 years, would never be theirs. I wrote letters to charities. I earmarked donations. I gave in writing what they had never earned in presents. There was one portion I set aside quietly for her. Not in her name, I knew she would never want to be dragged back into their drama, but a scholarship fund for women re-entering life after emotional abuse. Discreet, protected, permanent. It was the first time in a long while I felt like I was building something, not just preserving what was left. My lawyer looked at me when it was done. He hesitated, then asked gently, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And I said with a calm I hadn't known lived in my bones, "They lost their place in my story. She found hers." He didn't argue. He just nodded and began sealing the envelopes. I sat back in my chair as he packed his briefcase. The sun was starting to set outside, painting the walls with gold and shadow. And in that light, I saw my hands resting on the table, steady and still. These hands that had once swaddled infants, stirred soup, stitched holes into shirts. Now they were reclaiming something I didn't even know I'd lost. Power. Not the loud kind. Not the kind they taught me to fear. But the kind that doesn't need to be announced, the kind that moves like roots beneath the soil, unseen but unshakable. When he left, I stood at the doorway and listened to the silence. It didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I had done something irreversible. Not for vengeance, not for noise, but for grace. Because sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stop handing pieces of yourself to people who only come to carve. And so without a single shout, I rewrote the end of my story. It didn't take long. These things never stay hidden for more than a breath once someone goes sniffing where they feel entitled to tread. It was my son who found out first, through a mutual connection at the firm, someone who wasn't supposed to talk, but did anyway. He called me that same evening, voice sharp with the kind of concern that only ever shows up when money is involved. "Mom, I heard you made some adjustments. Is that true?" I didn't answer right away. I was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea as the sun slipped behind the neighbor's oak. The air smelled like rain-soaked grass and honeysuckle, peaceful. When I finally spoke, I said, "Yes, I did." There was a pause, then the sound of teeth clenching behind words. "Why would you do that without telling us?" Us, always us, as if the family only existed in a collective that excluded anyone who didn't fit their vision board. I said, "Because I no longer believe you would have understood if I had." That set off the avalanche. Within a day, my daughter called, twice, left long voicemails laced with disbelief and sugar-dipped guilt. "Mom, you must be confused. You've always said family is everything. We're your children." And then came the shift, subtle at first, then sharper. "If she manipulated you into this, you need to say so. We can fix this, but only if you're honest." Manipulated, that word hung in the air like mold. As if kindness couldn't be real. As if love only counted when it came with matching sweaters and a pedigree. I deleted the messages. They didn't stop. They started showing up, knocking on the door with tight smiles and two cheerful voices. My daughter brought flowers. My granddaughter brought pastries from that cafe I hated. They sat on the couch, complimented the curtains, asked how I was sleeping. But it wasn't care. It was panic dressed in pastels. And through it all, not once did they say her name. Not once did they ask where she went, how she was doing, what might have caused such a decision. It was all about what I had done to them, never what they had done to deserve it. Eventually, I stopped answering the door. One morning, my grandson stood outside for nearly 20 minutes, just stood there staring at the porch swing, the flower beds. Then he left a letter. I didn't read it. I burned it in the sink. Not out of hate, out of finality. I had tried year after year to model love, to speak gently, to include, to forgive. But they had taken those offerings and used them to build a pedestal for their own image. And I had finally stepped down. They weren't mourning the loss of me. They were mourning the loss of my resources. And in that space, I began to breathe again. No apologies came, no true questions, only resistance wrapped in panic. Let them scramble. Let them rewrite their versions of the story. I knew the truth. And the truth was this. When kindness becomes a currency, the richest hearts are often the first to be robbed. I didn't tell her right away about the inheritance, about the changes, about the choice I'd made with a clear mind and a quiet heart. She had never asked me for anything, and that's partly why I gave so much. Weeks passed. Spring leaned into summer. My garden bloomed early that year, almost as if it too had been waiting for something to feel right again. Then one morning I gathered the documents and drove into town. I stopped by the women's shelter, the one she used to volunteer with before the wedding planning had consumed what little peace she had. The director remembered her, smiled when I mentioned her name. She used to come in on her days off, she said, never needed recognition, just wanted to help. I handed over the paperwork, the fund in her name, anonymous in origin, but unmistakable in spirit, a scholarship, a grant, a lifeline, whatever they needed it to be. It's in honor of someone who showed me what quiet dignity looks like, I said. No ribbon cutting, no plaque, just a signature and a soft breath as I let go. That night I sat at the kitchen table and wrote her a letter. I told her about the fund, about the will, about how when I looked at the life I'd built, I realized that legacy wasn't about bloodlines. It was about who stood by you when the world tried to erase you. I wrote, "You didn't need to fight for a place in this family. You were the family. They just couldn't see it." I didn't mail the letter right away. I held it close for days, folded in my apron pocket, like a secret I wasn't sure how to release. But one morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house was still, and the air smelled faintly of the jasmine blooming outside the back door. I walked to the mailbox and slipped the envelope inside. It was done. A week later, her reply came in a soft brown envelope with no return address. The handwriting was delicate, careful loops and long tails on every letter. Inside, she thanked me, not with flowery words or exaggerated praise, but with the kind of gratitude that's woven from survival. She said she'd started fresh, a small apartment near a library, a part-time job helping immigrant families navigate local services. She'd joined a community choir. She was learning to play the piano, something she'd always wanted to do as a child but never had the chance. At the bottom of the letter, she wrote, "I used to think I was the outsider in every room, but now I know I was simply in the wrong rooms. You showed me that." I read that sentence over and over again. I placed her letter in the drawer where I used to keep their school drawings, their birthday cards, their baby teeth wrapped in tissue, a new treasure in an old space. They had been born into my life, but she had chosen me. And that choice, that quiet, brave, beautiful choice, meant more than any bloodline ever could. There's a stillness that comes in old age, not from weariness, but from seeing enough to finally know what matters. The rush of years has slowed, and in the hush that follows, I've begun to truly feel the weight of what was real and what was only ever noise. Sometimes I sit by the window watching the light fall through the lace curtains and dust dance in the beams like memories that never left. It's in those quiet hours when the phone isn't ringing and the door doesn't creak open that I think most clearly. Not about the betrayal, no, that has become background now, a low hum behind more important things. I think about her, about the way she once tiptoed through my house like she didn't deserve to exist there, about how gently she took the teacup, how reverent she was with silence, how she never interrupted. Not because she didn't have things to say, but because she never believed she was allowed to say them. I think about how easily they discarded her, not with cruelty sharp enough to expose itself, but with the kind that hides in politeness, in exclusion, masked as taste. And I think about the meaning of love, not the kind they claim to have mastered, the kind that came with conditions, with aesthetics, with whispers in corners. No, love is what stayed behind after they walked away. Love was what kept her knocking on my door that day, suitcase in hand, not because she needed help, but because she needed to say goodbye to someone who saw her. She writes now every few weeks, small letters, sometimes just a photo or a quote or a pressed flower tucked inside the fold. She sent me one last week, a picture of her sitting at an old upright piano, smile-wide fingers mid-motion. Beneath it, she wrote, "I play for myself now." It broke me, and it healed me. What they lost, they'll never know. What they could have had, what they did have and threw aside, can't be replaced with property or pearls. They were never disinherited. They disinherited themselves. Because love isn't about matching someone's vibe. It's about matching their pain with presence, their fear with comfort, their silence with understanding. They told her she didn't fit our family. But maybe it was never her who didn't fit. Maybe the family had outgrown love. And she reminded me what it felt like. She reminded me that inheritance isn't always money. It's memory. It's intention. It's a thread stitched through generations stronger than gold. I gave the rest of my estate to a cause built in her spirit, and I don't regret it. Not for a moment. Let them scramble. Let them mourn the money. I'll mourn what they could have become and celebrate what she did. She didn't fight for a seat at their table. She built her own. And I had the honor of sitting beside her. The house is quieter now. Not empty, no, not quite, but filled with a softer kind of sound. The ticking of the clock, the rustle of trees just outside the window, the hush of memory moving through the rooms like a familiar breeze. I've let go of much faces that once smiled at me with expectation, voices that called me mother or grandma but never really knew how to see me in the end. And still I don't feel hollow. I feel complete. Because the truth is, you don't need a full house to have a full heart. You don't need loud laughter or crowded tables if the people there require you to shrink in order to stay. What I needed, what I chose, was peace. She brought that into my life like sunlight falling across worn floorboards, quietly, gently asking nothing in return. There was a time I thought legacy meant passing down heirlooms and houses and recipes written in fading ink. But now I understand legacy is the love we protect when the world tries to mock it. It's the names we speak with reverence, the hands we reach for when everyone else has turned away. I don't know what they'll say about me when I'm gone. Perhaps they'll call me senile, say I was manipulated. Let them. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are just beginnings, with the noise turned off. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace.